Hi, you're listening to Chip Chat. Today, I talked to Wendy March, a principal engineer and research director at Intel, about what goes into designing future generations of Intel Evo PCs. And spoiler alert, our conversation didn't include any mention of core count or clock speeds. The teams that Wendy March works with looks at everything that goes on around the PC, particularly the user and environment. So we're about a year out from the launch of Intel Evo. That came with last September's launch of 11th gen Intel Core Tiger Lake, and at that time we also unveiled Intel Evo, a new brand, but it is something that's been years in the making. So today I have a guest with me, Wendy March. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do at Intel?
Hi, Marcus. Nice to talk to you. So, I am Wendy March. I'm a principal engineer at Intel, but I'm also the director of our research and experience definition team. And we're part of the client platform and silicon architecture group within CCG. That's a huge number of acronyms. Um, but basically, what I do is lead a team of researchers and designers, and we work with architects to define our future platforms. So we go out and talk to people and understand how they're using technology, and then how we want to design our platforms. Like what are like what's really important to them, and what do we need to enable for them going forward. Um, that's what I do.
So, principal engineer at Intel, I know these are some of the smartest people I've ever talked to at Intel. So, when people think of engineers at Intel, they think of people who design the transistors or the chips or the systems and the power supplies and the power deliveries. But you do something quite a bit different, everything that you've said. So, could you tell us more about, this is a different type of engineering role than the ones that most people think about?
Yeah, and I think that's um, part of being, principal engineer is a technical title. And so it's a little bit funny for me, really, that I've become an honorary engineer. But it's a recognition of what we do as being a technical role. So we sit in a very technical team, and it's about being a technical contributor to the team. So I'm focused on both user research and user experience definition, and that's what I bring to that technology. Really thinking about what needs to go into our technology. How do we design it to better support people's needs and desires?
I think that's exactly it, right? You can make the smartest technology in the world, but ultimately people have to use it. It has to be useful for
Mhm.
people. So, can you tell me about what what the role is of? I assume I see it as like a social science, right? How do people
Mhm.
interface with technology? What is that human-machine interface? Um,
Yeah.
can you tell me about that research?
So we do. Um, Evo was our first big attempt at doing what we've now kind of described as an outside-in methodology. So kind of not just going, well, we've got this technology, I bet it'll be useful for something, which tends kind of, that's kind of very inside-out method of trying to like, well, make it fit. But instead saying, what is happening in the world outside? So we start with research. We always start with research. We have trained anthropologists on my team, and they go out and do different types of research. Sometimes it's kind of longer, or sort of more exploratory research, just kind of really understanding what people's lives are like, how are they using technology, uh, what's different maybe about being, for Evo, it was about understanding what's different about being an independent consultant, for instance. So you have this life. This was pre-pandemic, so when we first started research, kind of thinking people who are very mobile, who are working from many situations, going out and about, um, and they don't have the kind of infrastructure that we do to depend on. Well, that's kind of slightly less now because we're at home, so we don't have IT at home. And you're moving between maybe an office that's not yours, you're moving to a cafe, a customer site, maybe working from home, and you really have to sort of plan your day. You have to take your kit with you, think about what you need, and you really have to rely on that technology every moment. So we really wanted people to think about how we made that work for people, how we really made sure that our laptops were always ready. The idea of being always ready when they were became really important, and we wanted to communicate the situations that people were in. Like, what was that really going to mean? What, that moment when you get into a customer's uh, working with a customer and you need to present and you can't connect and you're fumbling around on the floor. And that moment that everyone's had and is always kind of embarrassing and a bit difficult. And it's like we want people to feel confident and to feel that they can really trust our laptops to be there when they need them.
So these personas you've created, like the one that you just described, were these just assumptions that the team has made, or was there some real study of real people behind these personas?
Oh, absolutely. Our research takes different forms, and from the personas that we created originally for Evo and Athena, we we had multiple studies. So we had one sort of international study that we did with independent contractors, and then we had others where we looked at students and people working from home. And it was also drawing upon my colleague Mel Gregg's research, which she'd done over years, looking at people's working from home practice. So really understanding just that that kind of tight relationship that people have. And in order to create design personas, you do bring together kind of multiple research um, research sources, so that you don't just have like it's not just markers and just markers as markers. We tried to bring those things together to exemplify different aspects of our findings. So as we look for insights within the research, and then kind of think, well, what is most important? So we put together design personas, and then we put together a day in the life, and that shows kind of both what they're doing, the technology they're using, and what they're trying to get done. And that's kind of an important process for us.
So what was the scale of the research and the interviews and the personas? What was the sample size, and how many different personas did you create?
That's actually quite a tricky question to answer because we based it on multiple studies. But one of the big studies we did early on in Evo was, I think we talked to about 30 to 40 people. So it's not just kind of a survey. We actually go out and talk to people. We follow them around. We go home with them and follow them into cafes and kind of watch what they're doing often. So it's more in depth. It's qualitative research, sometimes backed up with quantitative, where we'll ask surveys. Um, so it's not about numbers so much as kind of depth. So we went in that case we were in the US, we went to Sweden, and we went to China, and because we were still traveling. So we did that research there. We then have ongoing studies that we do maybe around particular things where we got very, very focused on collaboration, and video conferencing is a really important thing that was kind of a key part of people's days that we wanted to improve. So then we did some very focused studies where, again, we went out and talked to people and video conferenced with them and talked about kind of what worked for them and what didn't and how they collaborate. So we've done several of those as well. So kind of as we kind of it go sometimes it's very broad and sometimes we'll kind of get like very, very narrow into particular research questions that we want to answer.
And it's interesting to hear that you made the distinction between what is qualitative research and quantitative, because in the chip
Mm-hmm.
business, especially when I mentioned transistors earlier, it's a very binary. It's on or off. But
Mm-hmm.
people are not binary, right?
No.
They have different usage models. I think the idea of back in the day when they tried to measure the average chest circumference of a man to find the measurements of an average man to build uniforms and build military equipment to them, they found that when you design to the average, you design for nobody. Sorry, that is an
Yeah.
interesting aspect of trying to design anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then you design for the average. You definitely design for a certain kind of average man, and definitely not a woman. The The two forms of research are actually interesting together because it helps you have more confidence often in what you're saying. Like we've seen this, we know that it matters to people. So even it's funny, one of the first interviews I did, looking particularly at video collaboration, and we talked to a young woman who was based in San Jose, and she was related to a she worked for a university actually in the northeast of the US, and she was remote, and actually remote from remote, because they had a West Coast office, and she was kind of just mostly working from home. And she talked about how she had to, have these meetings that would start really early in the morning, like 6 a.m., because it was all East Coast time, and she'd be expected to be on video the whole time. And how she was one of the first people I met who talked about what we now call Zoom fatigue. She was like, it makes me really tired, and no one was really talking about that. And so that was kind of really interesting. Sometimes you get these kind of individual insights, and then you go out back to more quantitative methods to sort of say, well, is she alone in that? Is she kind of completely unusual with her tiredness? You know, but obviously it turned out that she was just a very forward person in her Zoom fatigue. But it's kind of like, just she was kind of embarrassed to admit that just kind of sitting there and having to be sort of watched and be kind of performing the whole time just exhausted her. Uh, we also met quite a lot of people who talked about lighting, and how just they struggled with lighting, and how it just kind of, like, whatever they did, they just felt they were in the dark and they looked unattractive, which I kind of I could sympathize with. But just kind of like, what do you do to make that work, and how can we how can we use our technology to kind of understand that image, and help people look better, because really what you want to do, if you're actually on video, you want to try and look your best.
As we're very well practiced these days, right? For those of
Yeah,
you
I try.
watching the video version of this podcast, you can see that, but you can pretty much imagine that after a year and a half of working from home, this has become very used to it. Zoom fatigue is definitely a real thing, but I think we adapt, and I think that is one other hallmark that you talked about on Evo, is the adaptability of
Hmm.
of the designs and the hardware. So the next question I have is, so you bring all these research findings. Um, how do those translate to the technology, to the platform architects, to the engineers at Intel who design these systems and work with our partners? How do those findings become laptops or products?
So that's been really a very interesting part of our new sort of outside in process, and how we've moved from taking research and everyone going, that's really interesting, actually moving it through a process of definition, and then through technical decomposition process. So how do we actually kind of go, that's an interesting thing. Maybe that's something we can fix, or something that we can help with. And then really understanding that down to a level of detail where we know what the problem is, because you can't really solve it until you know what the problem is. And then kind of giving the requirements to actually fulfill that. So really a lot of what the research and definition work is actually giving detailed requirements, which then the engineers and the architects can respond to and say, okay, this is how we're going to fix it. So then we can say, as we write big requirements documents, a lot of documentation, that once we get all the way through to the end, actually, is it better? Like, did we solve that background noise problem? Have we made the lighting better? Because we want people to look good, and that it has to work for everybody and not just be washed out, for instance. Or um, we've said that the battery needs to last even while you're doing X hours of video conferencing, or when you have um, this kind of real life environment where people have a browser open and they have a Slack channel open and they're doing video conferencing, and all this thing that's going on in their lives. That's the real life situation that they're in. So when we come up with a solution, it needs to work in that situation. It can't just be this sort of with this like lovely technical solution, but it doesn't really actually improve anyone's life. So I'm like really focused on making people's lives a little bit better, just I mean where I can. So this is, how can I make that experience better for people?
Of course. And a lot of what you've described just to me just sounds like making a better computer, right? You're saying better cameras, better microphones, more features, a bigger or more efficient, a bigger battery or a more efficient system. So, I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, these are on all my wish lists for my next device to get better and better. Is there any of these requirements that you brought to the engineers at Intel that either surprised them or something that wasn't on the roadmap, something they hadn't thought of that came from your research?
I think that's an interesting question because in some ways you're like, yeah, like that's kind of obvious, of course you want those things. But having having the research insight gives us all a really clear idea of exactly what we mean. So when we just say, oh, it needs to be a better camera, or but it's like, why? What are people actually trying to do, and in what circumstance? Because you can't just go to an engineer. It needs to be better. Because they'll say, so in what way does it need to be better? Like, what do you mean by it needs to be better? Like, better's, like, they hate the word better. So you have to get a bit more specific than that and give them much more context. And I think one of the big things for me that the research and then the work that emerges from that, the personas, the kind of the sort of detailed scenarios and flows, is that it gives everyone a very shared idea of exactly what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So it's not just make it better. That we can't work with that.
And of course, a lot of the research that you mentioned that you gathered was the pre-COVID-19 pandemic times.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, video conferencing then, we had no idea how important that would be for users today. But have any of those learnings changed or morphed or shifted in any way, given that there's been such a radical change in how people use their computers?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think um, a little bit thinking about your previous question about kind of surprise. One of the interesting questions and sort of debates that we would have prior to us all going home was, does anyone use video? I'm frequently in meetings where people would just be like, well, nobody does video. But people do. People use video. This is people are constantly using video. Just you're not using video because Intel's not a very video culture. So we tend to see things very much in kind of our model. And we're like, yeah, nobody does that. Well, yeah, they do. And so trying to get people to see outside of their own experience into other people's lived experiences is really important there. So, so the surprises are sometimes what people are what people are surprised by is in and of itself surprising, actually. It's just kind of realizing that yes, people use video, or that people work in environments sometimes that are really, really noisy. And so as we have now gone, we've done this big shift into people working from home primarily, particularly in the US. So what does that look like? In fact, it looks a lot more like the lives of a lot of people we were describing before. So these are not, people are now no longer sitting in offices with nice little phone booths that they can go off to, with lots of infrastructure and great Wi-Fi and nobody drilling downstairs. So, now they're all kind of at home having to deal with all of those things and being expected to be on video conference, all the time, or on audio calls, with their kids also and their partners also doing those things. And a lot of those, it's not the same. It's obviously people are a lot less mobile, although they are sometimes mobile in their house as they search for a quiet space. But it's a lot more unpredictable for people, and it's a lot less controllable. So in that way, it's still incredibly relevant. It's just different.
Great. So So even with it in mind that Evo launched a year ago, still in the midst of the pandemic with 11th Gen, your research and this whole Evo's the brand, but the work has
Hmm.
been years in the making. And you mentioned this name earlier, and it's not the first time people have heard from Intel, Project Athena. But can you bring us back a little bit and tell me what's the relationship between Project Athena and Evo? How did one become the other?
So Project Athena um, was this kind of big program internally. So that's kind of in some ways like just our code name, but it's kind of the whole sort of huge, really group effort of bringing together people from all sorts of different disciplines, all sorts of different expertise, to really say how can we support our partners and our customers, and the whole broad ecosystem to really make the PC experience better. How can we make um, just a laptop that really works brilliantly for people? How can we make that experience just every day better? And that brought people from across Intel, focused on like battery life and like instant on, and how to make sensors that work better, and screens, and making things, everything work in a more seamless way. And really, um, so that was a big effort. I suppose it's been going on about 3 years now. So we'd all been working away on that before we launched the brand. We'd just been doing it for a while, but more quietly. And then Evo is the external brand of that. So that's the big sort of partnership with our customers, and it's about also Evo's about a sort of specification and like a guarantee to if um, you buy that Evo laptop, it meets certain requirements, and we have a whole team that is based on measuring that. Like we set specifications, we set requirements within our specifications for how fast different things have to be, how long the battery life will be, and then we work with all our partners to make sure that those devices meet those requirements. So um, it is, it's a brand in that way. So it's a thing you get in your hands, but Project Athena is the team of people that make that happen.
Speaking of getting product in hands, one of my personal favorites is the Samsung Galaxy Book Pro. Love it. It's I think one of my favorite Evo devices. But one thing to me I've noticed as a trend with all Evo devices is, aside from being just fantastic and beautiful, they're thin, right? They're made for
Hmm.
the person who's on the go,
Yeah.
long battery life, but it is for kind of what we call, the ultra portables, the ultra books, a term that Intel's coined in the past. But there are so many different types of PC users out there, right? Device
Hmm.
users. There are gamers, right? That either who have big desktops or people who want gaming laptops. Now, Evo has been very focused on kind of the thin and light segment. Was that just the scope of the research, or does this research actually encompass more and kind of the road warrior or at home worker these days is kind of the main focus? What's the extent and the breadth of the human centric research?
So that has been really interesting. So as you say, we started with Athena, and Intel's had social science and kind of a very user focused approach actually for a long time. And we've been in different parts of the organization. We've kind of tried to tackle this problem from some different directions before, and been focused on different problems. Like we have a big group of researchers and designers who focus on developer problems, for instance. So this kind of specific kind of practice of trying to like really focus on that whole laptop experience right down to the platform and silicon level for Athena has turned out actually to be very successful. So we then kind of expanded that. So when I said back at the beginning that I'm part of research and experience definition for our client platforms, we do that across the different segments. So I have researchers and designers who are focused on gaming, who are focused on creators, who are focused on education, and and there's a crossover there. So those some of those beautiful Evo systems are bought by people who are creators. Some of them are bought by students, probably more higher education students, but kind of they're not super distinct in that way for people. People we wear many hats as we move between our lives. So, but it definitely is an approach that we're bringing to more areas of our work within Intel, that we can say, okay, let's really think about what those requirements are, and how do we enable the platforms of the future? Because I think it's really interesting to think about um, the kids who are going to college now um, will be entering the workforce in 4 years. So as we're designing silicon that's going to be ready in 4 years, in like 25, we need to be ready for them. It's going to be emerging at the same time. So understanding the things that they're doing now, the things that they're starting to do, that's important to us, because how you kind of learn often in kind of college and in your first few work experiences, the growth of cloud-based collaboration has been happening for a long time, and it's a lot driven by sort of the experiences of people within education.
So what I'm hearing from you is, Project Athena is an ongoing project. Even though we launched Evo, this is not a one and done. The work continues, and I know I asked this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious that yes, a lot of the definitions and requirements that you built in pre-pandemic are relevant today. But has the pandemic forked any of that research or brought you down a different road that you weren't expecting? I mean, of course, everyone's lives have changed, but has it changed the course of the original, I guess, the path of research and the intent?
Um, as you say, it is ongoing. So we talk a lot about the research we did right at the beginning, but we do that. We've done big studies each year, looking at some of the different aspects that people are focused on in their lives. So I think what maybe not necessarily forked, but the way we've done research has changed. We've been forced to do it virtually. Like, everything happens now via the screen. We do sort of video based interviews with people, which has been really interesting. Actually, we do these kind of sort of multi part things where we talk through with people what they're doing, and we give them exercises, like diary kind of exercises to do. But it is virtual. So that has one benefit, in the sense that we don't, um, we can see people in multiple different places. It's not depending on where we travel to. I don't love it as much. I miss that being being with people, and particularly with people you don't know, and you just ask them different things when you can see their lives differently. So I miss that. I know my whole team misses that hugely. So that way has changed, but we still continue to do cycles of research. We didn't just kind of do it and go, oh yeah, we know about that. It changes. So that has been really interesting in what we learn, like how we learn new things. We got very, very focused on working from home, obviously, and what that looked like for people. Um, I think it has, how people juggle things, and how people change and think about the devices that they have, for instance, in their homes, has been really interesting. Um, one of the things, of course, is that not everybody has the privilege I have of this kind. I have a lovely office, and this is my office at home, and I have a space, and I can shut everyone out, including the cats. But not everyone has that ability, and um, so, and often people talk a lot about having to sort of put things away, and we'd already seen that, but I think realizing that actually it's a much bigger issue for people, that they ideally, people have a big display, but not everybody does because it feels like an imposition of work. So if you work in your living room or in your bedroom, you might not want that big work thing sitting in the corner, you know. So just kind of how you connect different devices, how you sort of kind of fold and unfold and set up your workplace so that you can put it away. I think that's been really interesting for us and thinking about how devices work together. So we're continuing to think about that and how important that is for people in multiple different ways. Um, and then just kind of, I think something that, you know, obviously we were thinking about collaboration and video collaboration beforehand, and it's become like hugely important. You know, camera on, camera off, like it's, you know, kind of people have very different kind of thoughts about that. But I think one of the really interesting things is the idea of sort of inclusivity and meeting equity that I think has come to the foreground. So as we're thinking about going back into the workplace, sometimes, and some people, and not everyone, and then really not everyone was ever there, you know. So like, how do you really bring some of the things that have actually been great about being remote? If we have people going back into offices and like how do you design for that? How do you understand that experience and actually design for it in a way that people are going to be able to use? So if you're still, um, you know, someone on my team is in Arizona and some people are in California and some people are in Oregon and they, you know, even in California, they're not, you know, they're not all in the same office even. So the occasions at which we'll all be physically in that same room, you know, I'm like, I don't even know when that will happen. And I think that's people are recognizing that for their own experience and realizing that, of course, yes, that was true before. We see it in education too, that people are kind of like, well, you know, the kids have gone back to school, but maybe those, you know, that class is having to stay home, or those children are having to stay home. And what's that going to look like? How do we enable everybody to be part of that? And it's been a huge benefit for people actually in the last kind of year for some people that they've probably been better, more included than they've ever been because they were at home before. And they didn't want to be the person at the front with a post-it note maybe. So how how do we actually continue to make that work and not just kind of drop some of those things that did work for people? You know, it's having be able to have captions is really helpful for people, either because um, you know their first language is not the language of the meeting or the conversation. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be about translation. It can just be like, I can't quite hear you, or I can't quite concentrate. How do we, you know, or I want to take notes. You know, so how do we make that a better experience? How do we realize that, you know, how do you, if you think about the visual experience, um, um, you know, my team's also thinking a lot about accessibility and inclusion, and how do we kind of think about that across our different platforms?
That's just going back to when I asked how did the research start, and you said you followed real people to coffee shops or frequent travelers who might be waiting at the airport terminal or at the gate and then working on the airplane, and now all of a
We don't
sudden,
follow them on planes.
oh, don't follow them on planes. Well, what if they're going to Hawaii? I mean, I'll volunteer to follow some mobile workers to Hawaii. But the pandemic, I mean, as unfortunate as it is, I think sounds like it's been a boon to the research and the kind of the different types of environments you see people inside their homes. Before you couldn't get a good look in their home, I think maybe the data that you're gathering about what some people's workspace, as you said, some people may not have a dedicated workspace and they're working through different environments and challenges and cats and children and dogs and all that sort of thing. So I think that is definitely helped. And one thing that you mentioned, and I'm glad you did, is could you tell me a little bit more about the accessibility considerations and the inclusion? How do we make this technology not just work for people who go to coffee shops or work at home among cats, but people who have different accessibility needs? How is that being studied and addressed?
Yeah, so that is, with as part of our Intel's Rise 2030 initiative, I is inclusion there. So we're trying to tackle that in sort of different ways. So there are some particular um, sort of bits of research that we are doing. So Sue and Sarah on my team are both kind of very engaged in this. So, sometimes that's a particular idea around a sort of technological approach to maybe to sort of, like, um, can we think about different ways of representing the visual information on the screen, for instance, so that we're actually reading the bit that you want to know about, not just kind of like, let's read it all to you, like how, understanding the way that people with visual impairment, kind of how do they kind of read the screen, and then how, can we do that better? Can we do that in a way that actually is more helpful and more efficient for them? And what would that be like?
Okay, so you've brought us to present day where we are. What does the future hold? What's next for Evo or Project Athena, or even the work that you do, the really interesting work that you do?
So for particularly around Evo, we've been really looking at sort of kind of expanding some of those personas. We were very, very focused on the sort of the more independent professional. Kind of really, we in the last sort of year or so, we've really been looking at our more enterprise workers, what that means in the sort of the idea of the agile enterprise, for instance. So kind of really think about that. And then we're looking to, kind of how do we bring things like sort of understanding more about our kind of higher education users, for instance, really thinking about students. And then we talked at one point really about kind of the way that people's kind of work split up. And so, we do annual research, but one of the things that we look at is trying to have like a different lens on each time. So we've looked at how people do sort of more kind of casual creation task, for instance, which is sort of interesting. And one of the things that we're about to start looking at is kind of how do people organize their lives, which is one of, we're always interested in the things I think that people don't talk about, like the less obvious things that are actually really interesting, but that they don't think to talk about. So working out how people kind of sort of organize their home lives and their work lives. How do they kind of measure time? Particularly if they have to build time or kind of organize projects and divide time. And how do they share different things that they're doing with others, and work synchronously and asynchronously. So we have a lot of questions and things that we don't know about, that we want to know more about. And as I say, it's often those quiet things that people do in the background. That's what we want to know about.
Well, Wendy, that's been a fabulous conversation. I think we're around at time, and I just want to thank you again. It's been a super refreshing conversation. As much as I love speeds and feeds, this is one that's been thoroughly enjoyable without talking about, gigahertz or overclocking. Nothing wrong with those. Do love those conversations, but this has been a very nice change. And of course, thank you. I thoroughly enjoy my Evo laptop. So you've made a better computer. You've contributed to Intel's goal in making better computing. So I appreciate it, and thanks again for your time.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you, Marcus. Bye.
Subscribe to Intel Chip Chat wherever you get your podcasts to be notified when new episodes drop.